Hello and welcome back to College Clinton and our second lecture. So, I know last week we introduced some concepts, gained some trade, we defined economics. It was a nice gentle introduction to economics, and then in the first class we went through some questions relating to that, nice and simple, good introduction. Well, today in our second lecture, it's where the big work gets done, the hard work gets done, because we're going to introduce supply and demand and markets today. So pretty much you're gonna arm yourself with the knowledge you need to employ, and you'll be employing this knowledge throughout your time that you study economics. There's pretty much not a facet of economics that doesn't in some way relate to supply and demand. So very important, and very important that we get this right. Now, fortunately for you, it's a really intrinsic and easy subject, concepts to understand. It flows naturally, and we'll go through it slowly together. But so, though it is relatively easy and intrinsic, very important, still very important. So, if you are in some ways confused, don't be ashamed to pause the video, rewind it, play it again, because we really got to get this right. Okay, so today we're going through markets, supply and demand, and we'll also touch briefly on consumer and producer surplus. So, let's start with markets. Markets, what do they do? Why are they so good? So, free markets are so good because they efficiently allocate scarce resources, thus creating wealth and improving human welfare. Okay? Very important, the efficient allocation of resources. And that's how we get wealth and welfare. So, if you don't believe me about free markets, well, we've got a great example of the Soviet Union and the United States. So the Soviet Union was a communist nation of the 20th century, a superpower. It was a centrally planned economy. They didn't use markets or the price mechanism to allocate resources. It was centrally planned. Prices were centrally chosen for reasons that were for the betterment, what they thought would be the betterment of society, which ultimately was not the case. So we're going to look at the Soviet Union and the United States, which country was which used markets, which was centrally planned, which was ultimately successful, which ultimately failed, and why. So let's have a look at our graph here that shows GDP per capita, which is an excellent way of showing really wealth and how wealthy your citizens are. So at the top here, unsurprisingly, we have the United States, which is ahead of everyone significantly. And all the way down the bottom, we have the Soviet Union, whose growth throughout the 20th century was anemic. Now, the United States was several times richer than the Soviet Union, but the most damning evidence here, I think, is Japan. So, coming out of World War II, Japan, this yellow, and you can see here in yellow, was even in a worse state than the Soviet Union, yet by 1960 they had caught up and then rapidly surpassed the Soviet Union, and were close to catching the United States by 1990, the disillusionment of the Soviet Union. Now, why is this the case? Well, Japan was a heavily free market economy rather than a centrally planned economy. And that's why Japan was able to allocate resources efficiently and have huge flow-on benefits for the rest of society, their society, that the Soviet citizens completely missed out on. The Soviet Union was dissolved in 1990, and entirely, almost, there was a few other forces, but really because of its failure to provide betterment for its citizens. Economic reasons were at the heart of that disillusion. So, as we said, the Soviet Union was a planned economy. It didn't use free markets to the detriment of its citizens. It was incredibly inefficient. Now, a lot of people, and I really want to ram this point home. So the Soviet Union was actually blessed with even more natural resources than the United States, if you can believe that. So the Soviet Union, holding everything else equal, should have been richer than America, but in fact it wasn't. Now, if you were watching our previous class, where we talked about introduced Venezuela, and all their natural oil reserves couldn't bring them out of poverty because of their poor allocation of resources and their central planning. So similar example in the Soviet Union. So this is why markets are so important and free markets are so useful at allocating scarce resources. So if you needed any more proof, just look at China. So we have under Mao's rule, which was incredibly centrally planned, growth was very anemic, and then after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping liberalizes the economy in the late 70s, early 80s, and we have explosive returns, explosive growth, bringing millions and millions of people out of poverty. A truly remarkable feat, and all because they decided to stop central planning and move to a market economy. So, I'm going to show you a quick video before we move on. And it's a Jewish immigrant from the Soviet Union coming to the United States, talking about going to an American supermarket for the first time. Okay.
But mir, wenn du kommst rausgefahren von Russland, du gehst, in mir nicht gehabt kein Geld, ein bisschen Geld, was mir genommen, wir gehen zu beten nicht, und ich kenne es mir nicht gehabt, gar nicht. So wie, was whatever sie gegeben Geld von der Chayas, und also kaufen etwas essen. So mir gehen in den Kopf, so mir geht, wir guckt von Russland rausgefahren, und ich kenne gar nicht kaufen, da veranschen alles ins Ding, was du willst, in the Crumbs store. Kramer, ja. And the main when we come in America, in America schon gewesen dort sind gehen in a King Supers gegangen, in der King Store gesagt, oh weh, sehr mir. Das gewesen für uns ein Jontif, wir gegangen zu kaufen Essen oder alle Sachen. Gewesen sehr von noch von Russland mit darf der kaufen, ich kann nicht kaufen, nicht sausages, kaufen das alles mit darf haben etwas emitzer geben von der du darf haben some emitzer wer waste was arbeit in der Kram.
Ja.
Ich weiß nicht, wie sagt das even auf Englisch, in the Russian says Pablaty, so we know somebody who is working.
Ja, es ist von der Unterwelt.
Von der Welt, ja, von der Tisch, under den Tisch.
Ja.
Right, so a really great example of the shock it would have been to travel from the Soviet Union, where there were massive shortages of all the things that people wanted. The United States, the supermarket, you just said it was like going on holiday. It was such an amazing experience. So, just a great example of markets. So, let's start with, now that we understand the importance of markets, let's understand how they're powered. So, supply and demand. So, we introduced you to a man named Adam Smith in our previous lecture, the grandfather of economics, and he has an amazing example in one of his books where he posits the paradox between water and diamonds. So why is the price of water so low in most of the world? And why is the price of diamonds so high? We need water to live, and in comparison, diamonds are fruitless. They might look pretty, but they're nothing compared to water. So why is it the case? Why is there such a price disparity? Well, the answer is obviously, well, maybe perhaps not obviously, it's supply. So demand for water is extremely high. Obviously, we understand that intrinsically we need water to live. If we had to pay for it, we were paying for water, we'd be willing to pay an extremely high price for water because we desperately need it. But in most of the world, water is ubiquitous. It falls from the sky. Diamonds, on the other hand, are intentionally kept extremely rare. There's a few reasons for that, but just it doesn't matter. Diamonds are extremely rare in comparison to water. So intrinsically, we should start to understand the reason why the price of water is so low and the price of diamonds is high. If diamonds fell from the sky like water, perhaps things would be different. So the key lesson here is you can't just go off one or the other. It's supply and demand. So even though demand for water is so much higher than demand for diamonds, the price of diamonds is still higher. And just think, there could be a incredibly rare element or mineral, all right? But if it has no practical uses and no one wants it, doesn't matter how rare it is, the price is likely going to be very cheap because no one wants it, right? It's intrinsic. You probably intrinsically understand it, okay? So, as Adam Smith showed, supply and demand go together, and that informs the price mechanisms which set prices and thus allocate scarce resources. So, let's isolate now demand. Let's just think of demand. can you think of some factors that help to determine the quantity demanded? And we'll use the example of coffee here. What are some factors that you think could help us, inform the demand for coffee? So, obviously, the first thing is the price of coffee, okay? So we have here PX, the price of good or service, price of coffee. So as we've discussed here, if we have a high price of coffee, we can assume that the demand for coffee will be comparatively low, holding everything else equal. If the price of coffee is low, we can infer that comparatively and holding everything else equal, demand for coffee will be relatively high. So the other things holding price equal, we've got the price of substitutes and complements. So what's a substitute? Well, a substitute is something you could have use or enjoy in the stead of coffee. So the first thing I would think of would be tea. So let's play with that, for example. If the price of tea went down and was really cheap, what do you think? Do you think what do you think would happen to to the demand for coffee if the price of tea was really low? Price of tea is a substitute. Price of tea is low. Perhaps a lot of people would be enticed who would formerly drink coffee to drink tea. So that'd be a lowering of the demand for coffee. And what about a complement? A complement is something that goes with that product, is an addition to it or is useful with it. It complements, hence the name, the product or service. So a great example of a complement for coffee would be sugar. How do we think the demand for coffee would react to a dramatic increase in price of sugar? Well, a lot of people drink, and myself included, drink coffee with sugar. We have a higher price of sugar. It's likely, holding everything else equal, that would put downward pressure on demand for coffee. Okay, let's have a look at income. So, holding everything else equal, if we have a lot of money, let's just look at a household, for example. The household is doing really well, have a high income household. Well, they can afford to spend money on things like coffee, maybe even buy high-end coffee. Okay, tastes and preferences. So, is this England or is this Italy? Okay, in Italy, coffee has higher demand. It's because of tastes and preferences, whereas in England, it's tea. And we've got things like expectations, what a consumer expects out of their product. And finally, and this is important for markets, the number of consumer in that market. So what we have here, we've got price and then a number of facets of demand exogenous to price. Okay, so here we should be hopefully in your mind starting to realize that it's what we're listing here is a function. Demand for coffee is a function of price of the good, price of substitutes and complements, income, tastes and preferences, expectations, and number of consumers. Demand is a function. We have two functions here, one for individuals and households and one for markets. So now that we're starting to realize demand is made up of certain factors and influenced by certain things, and that we can measure and see and understand. It's not just this ethereal concept that comes from nowhere. We really actually can dive into it and pull things out and pull different facets out. So from that, what we have is something called the demand curve. The demand curve traces the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of that good. Cerebus paribus, holding all other things equal. So we've got the law of demand, which is relatively self-explanatory if you think about it. It is an inverse relationship between price and demand. As we've stated previously, holding all things equal, the higher the price of an item, so in this case coffee, the lower the demand. The lower the price of an item, in this case coffee, the higher the demand. So this causes the demand curve to be downward sloping. And we're going to show a demand curve now for the first time in this next slide. So here we go. We've got the demand for coffee. So on this axis here on the left, we've got price. And as we go up the axis, price is increasing. And on the right axis, we've got quantity demanded. And as we go along this axis, we're seeing more and more quantity is demanded. And here is our downward sloping demand curve. Okay, made up, and it's made up of all of those things in our demand function here. See? All right, so we can see here we're moving along this demand function, this demand curve, sorry, as we move the price, as price changes. So at point A, price is $10, and so we demand, say, 50 jars of coffee. Now, if price was to go down to $5, we simply move along this demand curve to point B. At $5, we have obviously a higher demand for quantity demanded for coffee. So in here we've got 300 jars of coffee. Okay. So we're just moving along that curve because only thing we've changed here is the price. So what about, as we've discussed, a movement along the curve is demand responding to price holding other factors equal. But what about a shift in demand? A shift in the demand curve is a change in demand at any price. So it doesn't matter what the price is, demand changes. Either it goes up or down. So here we've got an outward shift in demand curve. We've got an increase in demand at any price. So in a second, we'll ask you what kind of factors you think played into that shift. But let's for now just have a look here. So we have our price over here, and previously on our first demand curve, we demanded this much coffee, jars of coffee. Now, when we've shifted the demand curve out, we've had an increase at any price, the demand. At that same price, we now demand far more coffee. Okay, we've had an outward shift. Can you think of some factors that would cause an outward shift in demand? So remember some of those factors we talked about that contribute to the demand function, and those will give you your answer. So let's have a look back. We've got here, we're not looking at the price of good, because if we were looking at the price of good, it would just be a movement along the curve. We're looking at for other factors, prices of substitutes and complements, income, tastes and preferences. So imagine, let's use tastes and preference. Imagine a wonderful advertising campaign comes out for coffee, featuring George Clooney and Margot Robbie, showing how beautiful and wonderful coffee is. I'm personally a great fan of coffee. We see, and that changes the tastes of consumers. And suddenly, they love coffee, and they want more coffee at any price. So at any price, demand has increased. It's shifted out. So what about an inward shift? Remember some of the factors we talked about, the same factors, but just in reverse. Remember how we said more income would lead to more demand? Well, in reverse, less income would lead naturally to less demand, okay? If there was an advertising campaign that came out for tea, drawing people away from coffee towards tea, that would get the job done. So let's look at an inward shift. This is a reduction in demand at any price. So here we used to have at $5, we used to have around 300 jars of coffee being demanded, quantity demanded here. But then we had a shift in the demand curve. So let's say that advertising campaign, it didn't come out for coffee, it came out for tea. People have moved away from coffee, they've gone to tea, and our demand has been reduced at any price. And so at $5, we now demand far less coffee than we did previously. Previously, we demanded all this coffee, and now we only demand this amount of coffee. So a big reduction in our demand for coffee. So I hope now that's very clear for you. We've gone through demand, and let's now look at supply. So just quickly, the sources of supply. We have individuals supply labor effort, businesses supply raw materials, finished products and capital, and organizations can supply services. So think about now that we've covered demand and the factors of demand. Let's look at the factors of supply, the determinants of our supply function. Well, of course, we've got the price of the commodity, the price of related commodities, the number of suppliers, technology, labor costs, seller expectations. These are all things that they're all factors that play into our function for supply. So we've got our firm supply, our market supply. It's all very similar to our demand function. But the key point here, as we're going to cover. The supply curve traces the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of that good, cerebus paribus. We have a law of supply. There is a direct relationship between supply and price, meaning it's upward sloping. The higher the price, the more suppliers wish to supply. Okay? So let's imagine, for example, you're a Colombian farmer and you farm coffee, sugar, cocaine. No, hopefully you're not farming cocaine. But let's say you've got a bunch of cash crops and you have to, you're a Colombian farmer, you've got all these cash crops and you allocate, you've got some land that's really good for coffee and some land that's, you can farm coffee on this land, but it's not ideal for it. So at a certain, when coffee is cheap, when the price of coffee is cheap, you're just using the best land for coffee. You're not using any extra land. The best land for coffee, and you supply that because you can still make a profit there. But imagine, what if the price of coffee goes really high? Perhaps you remember our first lecture when we talked about the subsidization of coffee by the government. Imagine the government subsidizes coffee. Or imagine George Clooney comes out with an espresso advertisement, okay? And suddenly we have an increase in the demand for coffee and, the price goes up. Let's just say the price just goes up for whatever reason. It doesn't really matter in this example. Suddenly there's a higher price. And you can make more money and the farmer is thinking, I can make more money if I supply more coffee. So he starts allocating land that, has a higher cost associated with developing coffee, for growing coffee. It's not perfect land, but he'll do it anyway because the price that he's getting is so much higher than the other cash crops. Remember, our concept of opportunity cost applies here as well. So, he increases the supply of coffee because the price has gone up, which is only natural. It's the inverse of our law of demand. It's our law of supply, which makes the curve upward sloping. So, here is our supply of coffee. So, at point A, when the price of coffee is really low, our farmers are only willing to farm a certain amount of coffee, a small amount of coffee. And we can see price here on this axis, and a point here, quantity demanded here. If you can follow my mouse here. Now, moving along the demand curve to point B, here at $10, it's a much higher price. We're willing to supply far more coffee. Look at all this much more coffee we're willing to supply. Farmers are allocating more and more land to grow coffee, even if it's more costly for them because the price they're getting is much higher. It should intrinsically be making sense to you now. Okay, and we move along from A to B or from B to A, anywhere along this demand curve. Okay, depending on what the price is. So, a movement along the curve is supply responding to price, holding other factors equal. A shift is a change in supply at any given price. So, here we've got an outward shift in the supply curve, a big outward shift. So in here, supply is increased at any price. So at $5, we used to only provide this much coffee. Now, we've shifted outwards the supply curve and we're willing to provide at the same price much, much more coffee. Okay, so can you think of some factors that would cause an outward shift? Well, remember some of the factors we talked about that contribute to the demand function or the supply function. It's very similar. So imagine, for example, I'll give you one. Imagine that we're a Colombian farmer and we employ a whole range of employees and suddenly the cost of labor plummets because we've got a lot of immigration. A lot of workers are immigrating away from Venezuela to Colombia to find work, and we can employ them and for a much cheaper price than we previously could. Well, amazing. We can make more coffee for the same costs. Well, that means we'll be willing to provide more coffee at any given price. Doesn't matter what the price was. We do know that there'll just be more coffee. Okay? And you can have a range of other things. Maybe it was a fertilizer that made our crops more efficient. Any of those factors will help us push an outward shift of the supply curve. Now, what about an inward shift? Here we've got an inward shift. So at $5, we were willing to produce this much coffee, and now we're producing much less. We've had an inward shift, a contraction of the supply of coffee. Well, imagine, for example, that some militants in Colombia, some revolutionary militants came and burnt down half of our crops. Or suddenly, we're only willing to use what's left that's really good ground for coffee. Our most efficient land can be used for coffee from this point on. So we've got a reduction in coffee production at any price. Okay. So let's put it all together. We have an equilibrium, a balance of these opposing forces of supply and demand, a balance that meet at an equilibrium. So here we go. We've got the two scissors, I suppose you can see them as supply and demand. And here where they cross over is the equilibrium. This is the steady state of price and quantity demanded. Price and quantity. We meet here at this equilibrium. And this is what allows this price mechanism working through demand and supply. This is what enabled that, when you go to a supermarket and you see it's filled with products, at reasonable prices, that it's because of the price mechanism. That's why American supermarkets were filled to the brim with products. That's why Soviet supermarkets were so barren and empty, right? There was always shortages because the markets are using a price mechanism, powered by supply and demand, that gets us to an equilibrium for all these different items. Now, it's worth noting that there's constant forces that are moving, here and there. Supply and demand, demand goes up, demand goes down. Tastes change all the time. And so this equilibrium is moving, okay? And we're going up and down demand lines and up and down supply lines. But we always keep quickly moving to a new equilibrium, okay? So we're going to have here a look at a situation where there's an oversupply of coffee. The price is too high. So price is set up here at P1, price 1. Okay? And look where demand intersects. So at P1, we're only demanding Q1 quantity demanded. So not a lot of demand at this high price. Okay? But think about it from the other side of the perspective. The supplier's side. At P1, price is very high. So they're look at where price intersects the supply line at point B. They're providing Q2 amount of quantity. That's their supply. So between point A and point B, there's this huge oversupply of quantity because only Q1 is being demanded and Q2 is being supplied. So there's this big oversupply. So what happens when we have an oversupply in a free market situation? Well, people aren't going to we're not just going to accept this huge backlog, this building up in our warehouses of coffee, for example, okay? So what will happen is the price will be reduced to start selling it, to move this product. And we can see this yellow line here. Move along this demand line. Now, what happens when we move along that demand line? Because price is going, and think about when we move along this demand line, price is going down. Well, supply will also go down. Remember, as we move back down this line, okay, the price that the suppliers is getting is going down. So naturally, the amount of coffee they're willing to supply is also going to go down. And these two forces are going to meet back down at an equilibrium point, our equilibrium point at QE. So price goes down and we meet at our equilibrium quantity, okay? So this is how oversupplies of items don't last long. There might be temporary oversupplies, but then our forces of supply and demand force that into a new equilibrium to get rid of that oversupply. And the reverse is also true of a shortage. Let's have a look when price is too low. So at P1 here, let's have a look at how much our suppliers are willing to supply. So they're at point A, where where price intersects with supply. They're only willing to supply Q1 worth of coffee. Yet let's have a look at demand. Because it's such a low price, look at where demand intersects with price at point B. And quantity demanded is huge at Q2. Look at how much more quantity demanded there is than quantity supplied. So we have this big shortage between points A and points B. Excuse me. This big shortage. Well, what happens when there's a shortage in a free market? Well, we don't have much of the product, so it makes sense for shopkeepers that are selling coffee. They're going to increase the price. And they're going to pay suppliers more to get what coffee they can get their hands on because they're going to sell it at a higher price. So look, price goes up and we move along the supply line. And what happens when, as that happens, as price is going up? Well, we're getting more and more supply because suppliers are like, oh, well, now we're getting a better price for our coffee. We're willing to make more. And look at the reverse on the demand side. Consumers are saying, well, I really wanted a lot of coffee back when it was cheap, but it's getting more expensive now. So I'm going to buy less and less coffee until we get to our equilibrium point again. We're back to our equilibrium, our steady state, where these forces are all balanced and we don't have a shortage and we don't have an oversupply. This is a beautiful thing. It's how we allocate scarce resources, and this enables us immense welfare. Okay, so let's have a look at shifts in supply and demand to markets that are in equilibrium, okay? So let's examine the market for oil, because I think it's a useful example, and look for some shifts in supply and demand and how that will move the equilibrium. So previously, we're just looking at, when a market's in a shortage or a market's in a oversupply, and we're looking at moving along those supply and demand lines. But let's shift them, okay? So let's look at our market for oil. We have our price, okay, on the left here, and our quantity, and this will be in like millions of barrels of oil, okay? What would happen if there was a huge worldwide increase in economic growth for whatever reason? Okay, well, it's natural that if there was a huge worldwide increase in economic growth, we'll need more oil being a huge factor of production. Think about all the new cars that are going to be sold. They're all going to need oil still. Not enough Teslas yet. So we're going to see an outward shift in the demand for oil. So more oil is being demanded at any price. So we go from D1, our original demand curve, to D2. So look at where demand intersects with supply. Supply is the same, okay? But our demand curve has been shifted outwards. So we have a new equilibrium. So we can see here, at our new equilibrium, the quantity of oil barrels quantity demanded has increased, and the price has increased. We have our new equilibrium here. So there is more oil being sold at a higher price, okay, at our new equilibrium for the market for oil because of this increase in economic growth. What if, in addition to this increase in economic growth, so we've got an increase in economic growth, there was a huge natural disaster or war in the Middle East? Well, then suddenly there's a shift in the supply curve, okay? I think it's only natural if there's an interruption in supply, we can't supply as much oil at any price, right? We're going to shift that left. We're seeing a contraction in the supply of oil. So we go from our previous equilibrium, getting shifted back. We're getting shifted back to a new equilibrium. So even though there's more economic growth and we want more oil, the problem is we're now facing the reality of even higher prices because that supply curve has contracted back. So look at the price now at 85, and so naturally we're going to consume less oil than we would when the price was at 65. So we're back at a 1 million barrels of oil quantity demanded, but at a much higher price, all the way up here at 85. Now, this is just one example, and it doesn't have to go to these points 85. I just picked these willy-nilly just to show. But what we are looking at is these shifts in the demand curve, shifts in the supply curve, and our movement of our equilibrium. We want you to be able to see and understand intrinsically, and say, if I say, the demand shifts outwards, or we have an increase in the demand for oil at any price, you can draw that on a graph. So if you're ever lost, just pause for a second, intrinsically think what would happen. We have an increase in growth. What is that going to do to demand for oil, for example? It's going to shift it outwards. We're going to have more demand at any price. We have a contraction in the supply of oil. What does that mean? Well, it means we're going to have a shift left on the demand, on the supply curve. Less supply at any price, okay? All right. Okay. So now that we've covered supply and demand, and we've covered movements along demand and supply curves and shifts of supply and demand curves, we're going to introduce our final concept for this lecture. And that's producer and consumer surpluses. So hopefully you remember in the first lecture when we talked about how customers assign value to items, how much they're willing to pay versus the price of that item. So we use the example there of shopping for a bottle of olive oil. So let's return to that. So let's say the maximum you're willing to pay for a bottle of olive oil is $10. And the supermarket's selling it to you for $5, and you purchased that bottle of olive oil. So you were willing to pay $10, you purchased it for $5. So you captured $5 of value out of that transaction. So that is your consumer surplus, your welfare added from that transaction. So a consumer surplus is, as you may have inferred by now, the maximum price you're willing to pay minus the market price, your captured value for the consumer. And so the producer surplus is very similar, just the other way around. It's the market price minus the minimum price the supplier or producer was willing to sell the item for. So let's go back to the olive oil example. So the supermarket is selling it for $5, and they were perhaps willing to sell it for $3, but you bought it for $5. They sold it to you for $5. So in this situation, the producer surplus is $2. They were willing to sell it for $3. They sold it for $5. $2 value for the producer. Remember, you got $5 of value, and now the producer's getting $2 of value. So our total value, our total welfare gained, both on the producer and the consumer, is our consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. So in this situation, it's $5 plus 2, $7 of value captured by this transaction. Okay. Now, the excellent thing, one of the many excellent things about supply and demand graphs, is we can actually see visually the producer and consumer surplus. So let's have a look here. In this green area here, we've got our consumer surplus. And in this brown area here, we have our producer surplus. So perhaps you can already see intrinsically how this works, but let's explain it anyway. So remember when we have our price and quantity demanded here. So let's say when we're just up to this level here, okay? At this high price, we don't have many consumers willing to purchase this product. But they are willing to purchase it. But guess what? They're not purchasing it at this high price, right? They're purchasing it at PE, the price equilibrium for the market. They can't just discriminate and sell to each customer their maximum willingness to pay, okay? And not in this example anyway. We'll get to price discrimination in later lectures. But for now, so in this market, there is an equilibrium price, and these people that were willing to pay a much higher price are getting a really big consumer surplus. And as we come down the demand line, as we move down there, as we come down in price, people are willing to pay less and less, for their maximum willingness to pay is less and less, but they're still capturing value, right? They're getting the product for PE, and they're willing to pay higher than PE. Until all the way down, there's extra consumers, till the last consumer buys the product at PE, and their maximum willingness to pay was PE. Okay, and so visually, this triangle here is our total consumer surplus from all the transactions in this market, whatever it might be. So let's say it's the market for olive oil. Okay, and we'll get into calculating this when we've got prices and quantities later on. But for now, just understand it intuitively and be able to visualize it. So our producer surplus is the other way. So just remember, the higher the price, the more we're willing to supply, the lower our supply, okay? So when the price is really low, producers are only willing to provide a small amount of product. But remember, they're selling at PE. So this amount, all these units, they're willing to sell it for much lower than they end up selling it for, because they sell for PE, okay, the market. Consumers can't, in this case, discriminate, right? So all these producers are selling these items. They're willing to sell it for much less than they ended up selling, all the way up till we finally get to the last item, which was sold for PE, and they were willing to sell it at PE. That last item, it evens out, okay. So and you add up all of those transactions with producer surpluses, and each item, the item down here has a really big producer surplus, and each one has a progressively less of a producer surplus until we get to that final item. Okay, and we add up all of them, and we have our producer surplus. Now, we have lots of triangles in these nice supply and demand graphs. Okay, and remember, visually we can see the total welfare from all the transactions in the market is just both triangles together, the green and the brown together, and that's our total welfare. And we can calculate that too. We'll get on to adding in taxes and quotas and all these other kind of cool things that get in the way of our nice, beautiful, unfettered free market supply and demand curve later on. But just for now, just nice to be able to visualize it and understand it intuitively is really good. Okay, so now that we understand producer and consumer surplus, remember back to our Adam Smith example of water versus diamonds. So I want to ask you, what do you think the consumer surplus for diamonds and water would look like? How different do you think those surpluses would be? Which one do you think is higher? Do you think the consumer surplus for, do we think we're going to have a big triangle consumer surplus for diamonds or for water? Pause it. I encourage you to pause the video and have a think about it. Go through, refresh yourself with all the topics, with all the things we've learned today. Which one do you think? So, it's water. You should hopefully you got it. If you didn't, don't worry. It's a very new concept. So, when we think about water, what's our willingness to pay for water? It's extremely high because we need it to live, right? We have to have water. So most of us are really willing to pay an extraordinary lot for water because we need it to live. But remember, the PE for water is, comparatively extremely low. Okay, so that would intuitively tell us that that there is going to be a really big consumer surplus for water, and indeed there is. And this is a really good example. All this blue here is the consumer surplus for water. Now, on the other hand, diamonds is not true at all, right? A very high PE versus our willingness to pay. So the consumer surplus there is much smaller. Producers presumably capture a much larger section of the value. So that's the end of week 2 lecture. Yeah, cool. I got a nice quote here from Thomas Sowell. A shortage is a sign that somebody is keeping the price artificially lower than it would be if supply and demand were allowed to operate freely. And that's generally a very correct quote by Thomas Sowell. Once you think about the modern day shortages we have in the West, where we generally have free markets, it's generally where something has occurred to prevent that free market. And an excellent example is rent controls put into place to create an abundance of affordable housing end up having the exact opposite effect. Rent controls have a incredibly destructive effect on the supply of housing. And so we can get into exactly why that is in later videos, but I encourage you to think about that for yourself for now. We have some nice... I wonder how many of you have ever watched the TV cartoon Hey Arnold. I'm definitely showing my age with that one, but that was one of my favorite episodes. And this guy here, he says, haven't you ever heard of supply and demand? He's an ice cream truck seller. He runs an ice cream truck, and it's the Hey Arnold's, I think, is set in New York, and it's the middle of summer, and it's so hot, and all the kids are running around just so hot and wanting an ice cream. And this truck seller, ice cream truck dude, starts charging outrageous prices for his ice cream, right? And he says to, I think this girl, I think it's Helga, she's complaining. She goes, haven't you ever heard of supply and demand? Anyway, great episode and of that TV show, and it taught us a bit about supply and demand as well. So anyway, that concludes our lecture. We will have a 2.5 lecture, I believe, because I want to also introduce a concept called marginal utility. So we'll have a quick, much smaller lecture tomorrow, or sorry, not tomorrow, but in our next video. But I didn't want to add it onto here because this video is already very long, and I don't want to confuse anyone. We just wanted to go through markets and supply and demand. So thanks so much, guys. I'll see you on the next 2.5 video. And take care and good luck out there. And once more, next slide I'll have a nice cat gif and my email, so you can email me with any questions. So good luck, guys.